let me tell you a little bit about our awesome, knowledgeable presenter, John Barber. So John has been a citizen scientist for over 50 years, active in green space preservation, the recovery of peregrine falcon populations, and the continuing recovery of eastern bluebirds. Now retired after 35 years in the business world, he is focused on restoring and maintaining biodiversity. He passionately performs habitat restoration and ecological gardening with native plants. A native of Shaker Lakes, he served on the board of the Nature Center at Shaker Lakes for 10 years, including 2 terms as board president. He now serves on the board of the Native Plant Trust. He is co-leading the Friends of Lower Lake, a volunteer program of the Dome Brook Watershed Partnership, working to restore habitat around Lower Lake Park in the Shaker Parklands. So with that, I would like to introduce John Barber.
Thank you so much, Steve. And good evening, everyone. I am John Barber, the co-chair, along with Peggy Spaeth, of the Friends of Lower Lake, a volunteer program of the Dome Brook Watershed Partnership. Thank you for being here tonight, and thank you to the Friends of Euclid Creek, and specifically to Steve McIntosh for arranging this presentation. The presentation is entitled Conquer Invasive Plants, a primer for yards and parklands. And that's a very audacious title for a talk, Conquer Invasive Plants. As you know, in Northeast Ohio, our yards, our city properties, our parklands, everywhere we look, we see predominantly invasive plants. And so the thought of conquering them, or perhaps getting rid of them forever, is in fact a dream. It's not going to happen. But fighting to conquer native plants with the Friends of Euclid Creek, with the Friends of Lower Lake, with other volunteer groups, is something that you can happily spend many, many hours and days, in fact, most of the rest of your life doing, because the opportunities are that large. And I want to start by providing you with a very, very critical construct that informs this entire talk. 90% in North America of the insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants that they co-evolved with. 90% of the plants, of the insects that eat plants, depend on what we call native plants. And so by having yards and parklands completely covered with invasive plants, we're in fact supporting about 10% of the insect population, and that is not sustainable. This presentation is informed by the ecological restoration work now in its 4th year in the Shaker Parklands in the Dome Brook Watershed Partnership, one watershed over from Euclid Creek. And working on about 45 acres, the Friends of Lower Lake have logged thousands of volunteer hours, removed literally tons of invasive plant matter, and planted hundreds of native trees, shrubs, and flowering plants. This talk is intended for both institutional and individual audiences. It really looks at local parklands, at city properties, and at yards. I can't say this enough. Invasive plants don't draw distinctions among all these areas, and neither do we. I hope that you've received from Steve a 2-page handout to go with this presentation that includes plant lists, references, contact information, and I'll be referring to this throughout the presentation. The area that we're working in is on the east side of Cleveland in Cuyahoga County. It sits on the boundary between Cleveland Heights, Shaker Heights, and the city of Cleveland. The red line that you see going diagonally through this map of the lake is the dividing line between Shaker Heights and Cleveland Heights, meaning that any work we do in the lower lake area not only involves a very complicated biological ecology, but it also includes a complicated political ecology, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But how did we get here? In May of 2018, Peggy and I joined a work day to remove invasive plants. We encountered the site in the upper left-hand corner, which is predominantly English ivy, Japanese honeysuckle, and porcelainberry. So it's a monoculture of 3 of our worst invasive species. And we worked there for a couple of hours and then went home feeling good and realized that probably by the time we got in our cars, the porcelainberry had grown over all the areas that we'd cleared. And we vowed then that we would come back again and again. And we did so. And we had volunteers want to join us. By July, we had uncovered a very interesting concrete foundation, or at least part of it. In the bottom left, by November of 2018, we'd uncovered a full 50 by 30 concrete foundation. And then June 28th of last year, the bottom right photograph shows over 50 species of native plants that have been planted in the area that was once dominated by 3 invasive species. What we found was that this foundation was the foundation of the Shaker Lakes Canoe Club, a club that came into existence in about 1907, picked the best part of the lake to build a clubhouse, a private clubhouse, very exclusive clubhouse. Dues were $15 a year, and you could store your canoe on the first floor. The Canoe Club was in existence from 1907 to 1976, when it folded and the Canoe Club building was torn down. During its life, the Canoe Club had regattas and jousting matches. This 1923 tilting competition shows somebody standing on the gunnels of a canoe having knocked his opponent into the water on the other, off the other canoe. Please do not try this at home. Our volunteers come from 5 cities and 4 countries. We welcome people of all ages and abilities, although this does look a little bit like a 1970s rock band album cover. It is, in fact, a very, very dedicated group of volunteers. Over 200 volunteers have worked with us over the last 4 years, but we have a core of volunteers who have been there almost every Sunday morning between 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock, working to remove invasive species and plant native species. So let's do a little bit of background information. What is an invasive plant? I imagine most of you know already, but it's not native to Ohio, spreads rapidly and aggressively. Very, very important that we acknowledge the fact that it spreads very, very rapidly. It displaces native flora. Things can't grow under this, they can't grow around that, they get shaded out by this, and over time our native plants just lose. Invasive plants persist in the natural landscape. We have about 100 of them officially here in Ohio, more plants are being added to this invasive species list, the formal Ohio invasive species list, on a regular basis. If you're curious, simply Google the Ohio Invasive Plant Council. It will have lists and some fact sheets and information on some of the worst of the invasive plants in Ohio. I put this cartoon in here. Sure, it's a bit of an invasive plant, but I haven't gotten any complaints for our neighbors. And of course, as you would expect, the neighbor is somewhere under the invasive plant. And I bring this up because our yard in Cleveland Heights is very similar to the problem that this yard faces. Our backyard is now has over 100 species of native plants in it, but on 3 sides of the backyard are invasive euonymus, invasive English ivy, privet, Norway maples, things like that. And we must walk the fence on a regular basis, especially in the fall, late summer and fall, when the ivy is in its growth spurt. literally cutting things back from the fence to keep them from coming into our yard. How did all these plants get here? Well, the horticulture industry is certainly one of the leading causes. There's so many plants that we find at Lower Lake that either were or unfortunately still are sold as landscape plants. Back in the day when they were seen as a panacea to this problem or that problem, but unfortunately, nobody knew at that time that they had a tendency to run amok. And I'll use all 4 species of privet that we have here in Northeast Ohio now as examples of that. There's also accidental transport. For those of you who have been to the new shopping center out in Orange, if you look at the gardens around the theater and REI and other places out in Orange, you'll see that all the gardens are very, very heavily infested with Japanese knotweed because the topsoil that was brought in after the mall was put in was contaminated. Habitat disturbance is another spreading place. Roads and trails. Birds spread invasive species by eating and pooping fruit primarily. Wildlife do the same thing. If you've ever seen raccoon scat or coyote scat, livestock, horses, pets, our very furry dog is a marvelous seed dispersal mechanism when birds get caught in his fur. Water, of course, seeds and vegetation flow down water. Machinery and humans, if you've ever seen the mud on bulldozer tracks, you know that that is a spreader of invasive species. And of course, it really does mostly all come down to us with some interesting history. The example I'll use is that around Lower Lake, we constantly fight a large infestation of white mulberry trees coming up out of very deeply buried and very thick roots. Those white mulberry trees are probably the descendants of mulberry trees that were brought in by the Shakers, the religious colony, the Shakers, who dammed the Doane Brook and built Lower Lake for a sawmill. They also wanted to grow silkworms. Silkworms come from China. The only tree that supports silkworms is the white mulberry tree, which had to be imported from China. It ran amok. The Shakers left town after about 60 years, and the white mulberry 200 years later is still present and still spreading. And finally, the absence of predators and pathogens. There are things in other countries that keep plants in check that we don't have here, mostly for good reasons. But we need those predators and pathogens on our invasive plants because otherwise we have to be the predators. Plants will move from one yard, park, watershed, or site to another place. They will move in spite of our best efforts. This boot sole is the boot sole of a extra tough boot. This is a privet berry jammed into or wedged into the sole of that boot. The next time I wore that boot into a muddy place, it probably would have gotten pulled out. So here I'm being a seed dispersal mechanism, although we do clean boots and tools very carefully after our work days. So what's the problem with non-native plants? Most importantly, the statement that I started this talk with, 90% of the insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. So the English ivy in the right-hand corner, non-native, it's in probably everybody's backyard, has absolutely nothing eating it. The leaves are perfectly intact. That way they are not supporting any insects whatsoever. If they don't support insects, then the birds have nothing to feed on and our food web is broken. Non-native plants have flowers and fruits of very low nutritional value like privet. Forsythia is junk food. Forsythia produces no nectar and no pollen and does nothing at all. It might as well be plastic except for the 2 weeks a year it blooms. Down in the bottom right-hand corner is wild ginger, a plant I hope you're all familiar with. It's the native, and it is clearly, by looking at the holes in the leaves, it's not being destroyed by native insects. It's simply feeding those native insects. And non-native plants are invasive. They create monocultures like the slide of the Canoe Club Foundation I showed you earlier. Part of the problem is that, at least growing up, the plant centers or the nurseries that I knew best acted on an economic model, not an ecological one. The model back then was buy on Memorial Day, mulch, spray, fertilize, and unfortunately poison all summer, and then discard on Labor Day before we went back to school. Repeat the next year and the next year and so on. The model is completely based on our calendar, not on birds' migratory timing. So if we plant on Memorial Day, we've already missed spring migration. If we dig them all up by Labor Day, we miss fall migration on the other end. So what are we going to do about this? Because it is very, very urgent. And I plead with you and I ask you, get out and get to work. You can get to work on invasive plants in your own yard, in city parklands. You can volunteer with groups like the Friends of Euclid Creek and the Friends of Lower Lake on invasive removal projects. But please get out and get to work. This is a chore. This is a fun chore, a fun task that you could work with great people on, and we can do something about it. Step one is to correctly identify the plants you have. And a good place to start, if you know your plants or if you have good guides, are to work in your yard. Identify the plant and map it. Very, very important. I will talk again and again about the importance of even hand sketching maps of your yard, of a parkland area you're going to work in. Yes, you can use GIS, different kinds of computerized mapping tools, but especially for your yard, a hand-drawn map is fine. And then once you know what you have, privet and barberry and forsythia and burning bush and things like that, what are you going to do about it? So you identify goals for management. We had one person come by our lake work session one Sunday and correctly announced that dandelions were an invasive non-native species, and when were we going to get around to removing the dandelions around Lower Lake? And we told her that that was not one of our goals for managing invasive plants. As a matter of fact, it was pretty far down the list. Once you identify your goals, then how do you do it? You choose the best management methods. We're going to go over quickly a number of those management methods tonight. A lot of those management methods include cutting things down. And so you have to say, well, what am I going to do with 5 cubic yards of garlic mustard plants in April? What do I do with all those garlic mustard plants? So disposal methods are very important. I'll remind you again and again, you always clean your boots and your tools carefully when you finish a work session so that you don't add to the problem by being a dispersal mechanism. And keep good notes. This is one of the things at Lower Lake that we found most useful, is to go back and say what worked and what didn't work. People take these notes home and use them in their yards when they have problems in their yards, because we believe that there's so many opportunities to be removing invasive species and replacing them with native plants that it's critical to us to share everything we know, which is one reason why I'm talking with you tonight. Plan your attack. This photograph, if it doesn't give you nightmares, I'd be surprised. This is at Horseshoe Lake in Shaker Heights. This is Japanese knotweed. This 6'2" individual is standing straight up. He is dwarfed in a sea of Japanese knotweed, one of the hardest plants, invasives to eradicate. And he's smiling probably because of disbelief that he's standing in this forest of Japanese knotweed. How do you plan your attack? You prioritize what to remove. You can't remove everything the first day or even the first year. What are you going to remove? Are you going to start in the best habitat? Or are you going to start in the area that's most at risk? Are you going to begin at the edge and work inwards? There's so many ways to go after various trees and shrubs and plants that are invasive that each area is a little bit different. And so when you prioritize what to remove, you probably want to have conversations with people who are on volunteer projects. Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District has experts there. The metro parks have experts. And so there are lots of people that you can take a map to and say, here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? You always have to work on your disposal methods because most cities now will not accept green matter in their landfill trash. And things like Japanese knotweed, invasives like Japanese knotweed, you cannot put in your compost bags because, to the best of our knowledge, the businesses that do composting do not compost long enough to kill Japanese knotweed. And so this is a problem. Disposal methods have to be thought about ahead of time. Always lay out good safety protocols. And those safety protocols involve what tools will you work with and who knows how to use them safely? Will you be working on slopes? Do you have people who are hyperallergic to insect bites? Are you working, as most areas in Northeast Ohio have, are you working in areas that have big infestations of poison ivy? A practice that we do is we pair people up as needed, particularly if we're working on steep slopes that go into the lake, or if we're working with power tools. Safety protocols are very, very important. And when you're working in public spaces can be city property, city hall grounds, the metro parks where you need to get check in with the metro parks people. When you're working in other city parks, there are a couple other steps to take. This picture here at the Lower Lake Dam shows the old 1897 bridge completely enveloped in tree of heaven, porcelainberry, oriental bittersweet, English ivy, and honeysuckle. And it's a public park. And so we had to get permission from the cities to work there. We had to work on disposal methods. And we collaborated with the cities on this. We started some outreach, thinking about signs, ecological restoration in process. What can we put on our website about what we're doing? We certainly wanted to remind everyone, including the cities, stop planting invasive species, don't make the problem worse. And we encouraged the cities to accept on their city GIS maps heavy infestations of invasive species. We wanted the cities to work with us to prepare the public for the removal process. Because this photograph, if this photograph were taken today, you wouldn't see anything because it was so gray and cloudy today. But on a sunny day, you would be able to see the bridge and see the street light, and it would look very, very bare because of everything in here was invasive, everything in here was taken out. And the trees and shrubs that we planted in place of these invasive plants have not yet grown to this height. So you need to prepare the public for a removal process because it's going to look different than it did in this, for example, in this picture here. And you want to enlist public support and help for planting. We have found it's much easier to get people to help plant than it is to help pull ivy, although we do have some expert ivy pullers. But when you work in public spaces, there are a couple more steps to take. And one of those other steps is that if you decide to use herbicides in your projects, this is a choice that you have in your yards and you have in your public spaces. If you do decide to use herbicides, you must work under the supervision in public spaces, work under the supervision of a licensed pesticide applicator. There are a number of other steps to take using herbicides in public spaces. So what it all comes down to is Clue. I hope many of you remember the board game Clue. It really is the wrench in the ballroom with Colonel Mustard. So if you're looking at invasive species, you want to kill what, where, and with what. So looking at in terms of how straightforward is it to use certain things? Prevention is always best. Don't plant invasive species. Don't let invasive species get firmly ensconced in an area. And one of the examples that we have is in one area of the Doan Brook now. There's going to be a new development. And on the edge between the new development and the Doan Brook Valley, the developer is proposing to put in 150 plants of fountain grass, which we have found to be very invasive, and in fact is banned in a number of Western states as invasive. And so that's one of those things where we would step in and talk with the developer and say, look, instead of planting fountain grass, which is invasive, let's plant something else, and do some education, perhaps work with the developer to choose another option. Cultural and sanitation gets back to, we want people to plant native plants for the sake of our insects and birds. And we want to make sure that we're not spreading invasive species by boots or tools or dogs or whatever. And then physical and mechanical. We're going to spend a lot of time on physical and mechanical. How do you get rid of invasive species that are well established? We won't spend a lot of time on biological controls. Probably the most well-known biological control is a pest that goes after purple loosestrife that infests a good part of Euclid Creek, as well as a good part of the Doan Brook and other watersheds in Northeast Ohio. There is something that can be loosed upon that purple loosestrife that does set it back and may, in some instances, even kill it. But the Friends of Lower Lake is not working with biological controls. I did see a very, very interesting article saying that there is now potentially something, a wilt, that will go after tree of heaven, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Very exciting. The one issue with biological controls, or one of the many issues with biological controls, is how can you be sure that it is going to kill only the targeted species? So this pest that goes after purple loosestrife, when it runs out of purple loosestrife, wonderful day, might go after something else. And we have to be absolutely sure that this is not going to be something that we release to be a disaster down the road. And chemicals, particularly herbicides, are very effective on a number of invasive species. As I mentioned before, this is a choice that you as an individual in your yard or you working on a project team can make either pro or con. So control methods in the residential yards, manual and mechanical. So much of it is pulling and cutting and digging out. And you can overseed invasive plants and interplant to outcompete. And you can use chemicals. You can use things like Roundup in your yard if you choose to. On larger scale projects like great big park projects, you can use biological controls, fire, grazing. Yes, there are firms, including firms in Ohio, that will rent goats to come chew on your invasives, fence them in. And you can also use chemicals. So let's talk about manual and mechanical removal. These are primarily digging. They're good for yard infestations. It can be chemical free. It is very labor and time intensive to do this, pulling ivy, especially vinca, invasive vinca and invasive English ivy, invasive euonymus, the creeping euonymus. It is very, very time intensive. And as you can see around the feet of the two guys working and the one guy mandatorily supervising, you can see that this also disturbs the soil enormously. And in the area that we're working in around Lower Lake, which is in the background here, Lower Lake's shoreline and habitat has been disturbed and replanted and dug up, and an orchard and a park and then let grow wild for almost 200 years. And so the seed bank is very, very heavily infested with invasive plant seeds. And as a result, when you do this disturbance, this mechanical removal of trees and shrubs and ivy and vines and things like that, it does nothing but encourage the invasive seeds in the seed bank. So we did a massive English ivy removal project in one part of our work area where we took out yards and yards and yards and yards of English ivy and came back 3 weeks later and saw another invasive species, lily of the valley, had come up in by the hundreds. And in our years of working there, we'd never seen lily of the valley come up. And it was simply sitting below the English ivy and the euonymus, waiting for the soil to be disturbed and the ivy to get out of the way so it could grow. And then we had to go back and remove all the lily of the valley, the invasive lily of the valley. Simple pulls and dispose, cutting flowers and seed heads, repeated cuttings of new growth, which we think is a very, very excellent alternative for a number of species. But it does require a commitment from you as the person removing invasive species to say, I will be back at this patch with my map every year for the next 5 years or the next 10 years, working to ensure that in fact the roots that you think are cutting, that you're exhausting by cutting all the time, are in fact dying. This is one that has very, very high maintenance. You can dig out roots and all with things like privet and barberry and forsythia, do have to monitor it. Or you can use my favorite, the tree wrench. The man in the red hat has a 6-foot lever that has teeth on the end. It's a buckthorn stump that's been cut down and partially dug out, and then you lock the teeth of this Big Daddy extractigator, and I'm being serious, that's what it's called, and you can lever the entire root ball out of the damp ground. And this is very effective when you're working with Japanese honeysuckle, buckthorn, and some of the 50-year-old privet, 60-year-old privet shrubs that we're doing, a tree wrench. You can also use chemical control. We use a glyphosate concentrate that is based on the recommended concentration for various plants. It's particularly effective on common and glossy buckthorn. It is a dabber. We use something called cut stump treatment. We do not spray. We use a cut stump treatment with dye in it where you dab it on the stump of a plant that you can't dig out for one reason or another. And it soaks into the root, kills the root, and disappears over time. However, it is something that can be used. It is a choice. There are alternatives to it, particularly for your yards. And I'm happy to show you some examples a little later on of the good and the bad. Some other removal tactics: overseed and interplant. If you talk with the folks at the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District, which I very strongly encourage you to do, they do a seed roundup every year, and they have massive amounts of native plant seeds that they get out into public areas and also into people's hands. You can also burn with a tightly controlled fire, with the emphasis being on tightly controlled. This is an example of a propane torch on a long stem that can burn things like lesser celandine, the hideously invasive lesser celandine. And I put here very publicly, have water and a cell phone handy when you are using fire. Then the question is, what do you do with what's removed? You leave you can leave some debris to decompose in a place where it's feasible. And this is really preferred because you don't make it anybody else's problem. And you can cut down things and stack them up to dry so that they don't reroot. You have to discard all of some plants, like Japanese knotweed and porcelain berry, things that will root from either the smallest, even the smallest piece of a plant. You can discard the fruits and seeds of some if you choose to, like fruiting buckthorn. What you don't want to do is you don't want to compost unless you're certain you're not going to spread the problem. Again, a number of municipal compost facilities either don't know or don't compost at a temperature or a duration long enough to kill invasive species. one of the things we're doing around Lower Lake is for those things that it is okay to chip, we are chipping those species and using the residue of the chipper for trails because the species stay right there. So let's talk about a few things. Garlic mustard, Ohio's top 10. This one is primarily in the spring. You go through wet, slightly wet places, you pull the whole plant, you pull it before it goes to seed, you bag the entire plant and you put it in the trash. There's really, it's hard to find other things to do with it. I know the Metro Parks puts it in black plastic bags and leaves it in the back of some of their parking lots simply to cook for 2 summers so that the plant is thoroughly dead inside the bag. I have on here, never leave this plant by the trail. There are some people now who argue that when you pull up the plant, you can completely break the stem. You've got to hear it snap. And that will keep a pulled plant from developing a seed, even though it's out of the ground. I think the jury is still out on that one, but it's a possibility that would make disposal much easier. Lesser celandine is spreading throughout Cleveland Heights and in a number of our parks. Very, very aggressive. It's often confused with the rarer and taller marsh marigold. It's very, very hard to pull up because they're tiny tubers, and you do have to trash this one. Chemical control or targeted burning may be required, particularly for large infestations. One of the things that we're looking forward to trying is to interplant lesser celandine with sedges to try to outcompete it. Japanese knotweed is the concrete cracker. If the rhizomes of this plant get into bridge gaps where it's very common, it will literally crack the concrete. And this is one where you want to sound the trumpets if you find it, because it spreads so easily and so far, and it's very hard to get rid of. In the United Kingdom, if you sell a house now, you have to disclose whether that house property has Japanese knotweed on it, the way we have to disclose the possibility of a lead infestation. Japanese knotweed diminishes the commercial value of a house so much that it is a required disclosure in the United Kingdom. Just amazing. English ivy, everybody has it everywhere. It shades out natives and tree seedlings. It has now been found to be the host plant for oak wilt, something that we cannot afford to have spreading. Except as a cover, it's pretty useless to wildlife. It only seeds when it climbs, or at least I believe it does. So this is one where wherever you see it on trees, cut it at the base. My preference would be that you treat the stump of what you cut with cut stump treatment, but at least cut it. You don't need to pull it off the tree because it will damage, trying to remove it will damage the bark. You can just let it die. But get this plant off of trees, because that way we can lessen the how often it goes to seed. Vinca, it's very, very hard to get rid of. Pull it from a wet soil or a damp soil, and we bag it. We've also tried drying it completely. Japanese barberry, one of the ones I'm most eager to get rid of. It is so commonly planted in our yards as a hedge shrub. It is practically impenetrable, very painful to remove. But again and again, we see it, one specimen plant in somebody's front yard, and then across the street in the watershed, we see little baby barberries marching down the hill toward the creek. Rabbits and birds disperse the seeds through fruit, even though there isn't much good in the fruit. Most importantly, this is associated with higher incidences of ticks, because ticks are also, hosts of ticks are also deer mice. Deer mice can protect themselves from predators by being in and among the sharp thorns of this shrub. And I do not like ticks. So dig this one out, put it in the trash. One of the interesting things that I want to encourage people to do, I'm hoping that this summer the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District will do this, is to have a bounty program on Japanese barberry. So when you dig up a Japanese barberry plant, You throw it in the back of your car and bring it to some area, some parking lot, and you turn it in. And that's a bounty program, because in return, you could get a native shrub to plant in its place. You could get a discount coupon for one of our native plant nurseries, something like that, because Michigan and Indiana, some counties in those states, have found bounty programs to be very effective in getting rid of things like Japanese barberry. And if you don't believe that bounty programs can be effective, ask any wolf that you find in Ohio, because you won't. They were wiped out by a bounty program in the 1800s. Privets, we have at least 4 species of privets that have been introduced here since the 1700s. It's probably the most common yard shrub. Take it out, dig it out. It is very, very invasive. One entire branch of the Doan Brook over at Horseshoe Lake is now overgrown with privet from one parent shrub. You can replace it with spicebush, cranberry, inkberry, winterberry. All of these things are on your handout. But get this thing out of your yard and cut it back in the parklands where you see it. Bush honeysuckle, again, 4 species. There's a common theme here. It spreads via roots and berries. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, it can crack stone walls with its roots and how it grows. Get it out. You're going to need to do either repeated cuttings or cut stump treatment, because this is one plant that when you cut it back, it comes back with far more vigor than the original plant. Common and glossy buckthorns are our most common invasive plant in Northeast Ohio. If you think of areas around Holden, in the metro parks, this is one that spreads. It completely shades everything that's growing under it. It comes out earlier than most of our natives, so our spring ephemerals can't grow, and it stays green in the fall longer than most of our natives. And it prevents other trees and other shrubs and flowering plants from growing under it. It is dioecious, so that there are female plants, and you can attack the female plants first to try to stop them from going to seed. You'll see the remnants of seed on certain plants. Take those plants down first. It is so easy to replace these with winterberry and all the species of dogwoods that we have in our toolbox. Porcelain berry can grow we've seen stumps of porcelain berry that are 12 to 14 inches in diameter, and we've seen it up as high as 60 feet in trees. Cut it back, get the vines out, treat the stumps, and you have to revisit again and again and again, because this is one that very, very heavily infests a seed bank. Winter creeper euonymus, still being sold today, unfortunately. It covers everything. It climbs trees. It has much deeper roots than English ivy. So the area that you pull it from, you have to map it, because you're going to be having this thing come up for years. The tree of heaven, ailanthus, also known as the mother of millions because of its seed production. This is one where we've seen sprouts come up 20 to 30 feet away from a cut stump. We have to pull seedlings all the time because the seeds are in the seed bank. But this one is very bad. It is also the host of the spotted lanternfly, which is possibly our next emerald ash borer. It's just crossed the Pennsylvania line into Ohio. It prefers tree of heaven. So here in Northeast Ohio, the more trees of heaven we can remove, the more preferred hosts of the spotted lanternfly we can remove. You see on the left, this tree of heaven was girdled, deeply girdled. 2 weeks later, there were 6-foot sprouts coming out of the stump because it's such a vigorous tree. We had to, when we dropped it, finally got around to dropping it, we had to get cut stump treat it several times. And here's just one picture of what trees of heaven seed heads look like. So what do we do instead? So I've told you, I think we've encountered at least 25 invasive species, most of the Ohio top 10 around our canoe club site, around our lower lake site. And we are pulling them out constantly and monitoring and maintaining and monitoring. And instead, what we're putting in are native plants. These are native plants that we've gotten from nurseries, and you have some sources on your handout. We've grown them from seed. We've split plants in our yards and brought them over to Lower Lake. But the whole purpose is not to just remove invasive plants. The purpose is to restore the food web for plants and insects and birds, to get that food web back in place and have a healthy functioning ecosystem. And to do that, it's plant. You have to plant when you take out the invasives. So here's a couple examples of native vines, including 5-leaved ivy or woodbine, Virginia creeper, that's one of our favorites. Native shrubs, again, these are on your handout. And shrubs, because you and we work in watersheds, shrubs are such a critical part of watershed health. I want to put this slide up for you. This slide is from Doug Tallamy, for those of you who have heard him talk or read his wonderful books, and those books are on the handout. One of the things that he says is that birds and insects and plants are all, of course, tightly tied together in the food web. And what plants host caterpillars? Because caterpillars are the most important food for nesting birds and also for migratory birds. There's a whole nother talk on why they are the most important. But Doug Tallamy and his graduate students counted the number of caterpillars on native shrubs species and on non-native shrub species. And this chart is just a very brief summary of that. So when you look in your yard and you find barberry with hosting 12 species, and forsythia hosting 1, and buddleia hosting 1. And then you go up and look at native dogwoods, 118 caterpillar species, and viburnums, 104. And you can see that it's the native shrubs that rebuild our depleted food web. Native trees, it's the top 3 or 4 genera: oaks, cherries, willows, birches. We have to get more of these in place and leave the leaves underneath them. And this photograph of this gorgeous white oak just emphasizes that while the caterpillars in the summer are living up in the top of the tree, they have to overwinter somewhere, and they drop down to the ground and into the leaf litter. So we need to leave our leaves in place at the base of our trees so that our insects can have their complete annual life cycle. What did we do to recruit volunteers? And this is a picture looking down to the lake with some of our volunteers pre-COVID. They're pre-COVID. We talked with passersby who asked us questions. We have a postcard we hand out that says, please come work with us Sunday mornings when the weather's good, starting up again in probably March. Between 10 and 1 o'clock on the shore of Lower Lake, come work with us. We'll train you. We'll learn together because we're always learning. We do presentations to the public. We have an email newsletter, which you can sign up for. I'll tell you about that in a moment. We have a Facebook page, of course, and we have a website. And we always emphasize to everybody our safety protocols. We do have some volunteers who would love very much to slide down a steep bank on their butts with a running chainsaw to go after a honeysuckle, but we don't let them do that. So to everything, there is a season. All right, it's not one size fits all for every plant or every time of year. In the new growth, we remove the new growth throughout the spring and summer. Herbicides for stem treatment are best used in the fall if you decide to use them. We do have to cut back some invasives every time they get 30 inches tall. We're now running we're in the 4th year of running an experiment with Japanese knotweed, cutting it back every time it grows. up to about 30 inches. We're trying to exhaust the roots. And each year we try to expand the scope of work, the same as you should do in your yards. You start with barberries this year, or you do privet this year, or you do English ivy, or English ivy and barberry, but expand the scope each year. So please, please get to work. Learn to distinguish invasive plants from native plants. Lots of things on the web. Just Google invasive plants of Ohio. Websites will pop up with fact sheets everywhere. And I also have in my handout on the backside a recommendation, Invasive Plants of the Upper Midwest by Elizabeth Sarapata. There is a copy in the Euclid Public Library I noted. It's also a book you may want to have your own copy of from your local bookstore. An excellent reference. Remove invasive plants everywhere you can, please. A number of us keep going into new areas and trying to work in new areas, but we don't have enough volunteers to cover every place that we have. Replace with plants native to Northeast Ohio. And we urge straight species native plants. We don't completely understand what varieties do to pollinators and how sturdy they are and that sort of thing. So we Friends of Lower Lake sticks with straight species native plants. And their sources, again, like the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation sale and other places around us will have native plants for sale this spring. Keep your eyes out. But finally, monitor, monitor, monitor. Map everything. You're going to go back and revisit it. You're going to have to go back and revisit the areas you work in. You'll probably want to see how your native plants are doing. But please remember that this is a lifetime endeavor for you. For more information, including signing up for our emails, our infrequent newsletters, please email us at friendsoflowerlake@gmail.com and get to work with a volunteer group like the Friends of Euclid Creek or us. Learn as much as you can, and please have fun. Thank you for your time tonight.
God, that was awesome. Thank you so much. Are you ready for some questions?
Sure.
All right, wonderful. There was a few. If you have any questions, feel free, excuse me, to use the chat. And some of them have been answered, but I may have missed that. So I'm just going to start at the top. So any advice specific to addressing lesser celandine? We have woods behind our house and it is all over the place.
Part of it is that lesser celandine is relatively new to this area, and not many people understand the best way to get rid of it. I think that the things that have been proven to work the most have been spraying with herbicides, which is something that should be done very carefully and after a great deal of consideration. If it's on public property, you have to have a pesticide applicator's license supervisor, as well as permission from your township or city. Another way that people have gotten rid of it is burning it with a propane torch. If it's a big infestation, that's very hard to do. The one thing that we do know is not successful has been to simply dig it out because there are tiny, very, very tiny corms, great numbers of them. And all you do is when you try to dig it out, unless you are literally excavating down 6 inches, all you're doing is spreading the corms farther. So this is a very difficult one. It's not quite as bad as Japanese knotweed, but it's one of the worst. And I'm afraid right now, mechanical means have not proven to be useful.
All right, awesome, thank you. That was a thorough response. We have another one. Where can we report invasives? I've heard of some projects creating databases, but I think the one I heard of was in Michigan.
Well, that's probably the case. There are still efforts afoot to get cities to be more concerned about invasives so that they could be mapped on the city GIS as cities bring up more and more citywide maps. So far, the big county mapping project has not installed a layer. My hope would be, and my thought would be, since I can volunteer Steve's time, Steve McIntosh's time here, is that at some point, the Friends of Euclid Creek and the Donebrook Watershed Partnership and other watersheds will have a common reporting way of doing that. Because I know certainly for the Donebrook watershed, we have an informal inventory of invasives in the upper watershed. But we don't have anything on the outskirts of the watershed, which is very important to get since most of these come in from yards. And we haven't done anything in the lower watershed yet until you get to Lakefront Nature Preserve. So put pressure on Friends of Euclid Creek, put pressure on your cities to come up with some way of having a citywide map. And in the meantime, keep your own map, because that is so important to do.
Excellent, excellent. All right, next question. We're just going to roll through these. What is your recommendation for removing Phragmites that are in the riparian area of Euclid Creek?
I'll ask you to talk with the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. We do not work with Phragmites yet at Lower Lake. We have a very small patch of it. But that one, again, is extremely difficult to get out with manual removal. I think they are finding that it's allopathic, and it has a tendency to kill anything that tries to go around it, grow around it. So you need to get professional help on Phragmites. And I say that not sarcastically, but I say that because the Natural History Museum has done wonders getting rid of Phragmites at Mentor Marsh. And the results have just been stunning in terms of an increase in biodiversity and amazing things. But it was an enormous effort and beyond the scope of what the Friends of Lower Lake does.
All right. Pachysandra, friend or foe?
Foe.
Foe, easy answer. There you go.
Did I think about that too long? There is a native Pachysandra that you can get, Allegheny spurge. I don't remember the Latin name for it, but it isn't nearly as perfect as the Japanese Pachysandra that is sold. It's not as perfect, but it's far more interesting from an insect perspective. So, and Pachysandra is invasive. The Metro Parks spend an awful lot of time trying to get rid of Pachysandra from some of the old homestead sites where when they created the park, there were old homesteads that now are surrounded by invasive daffodils and Pachysandra and other things that were planted around the homestead.
Sorry, what does Cleveland Heights do with the yard waste bags? I've put out innumerable bags of English ivy.
Cleveland Heights does send them out to a private contractor, and that private contractor has changed a couple of times. And that contractor chews everything up and composts it. And currently, Peggy and I are working to get some more details about what happens with that compost and where does it go? Where do those chipped up bags go? Part of the issue is for any city, and I do encourage everyone to inquire with their city about what happens to their compost, their craft bags, yard waste bags, whatever you want to call them. Part of the problem is that the cities under great financial pressures will often rebid their compost pickup. And so it's something where you have to keep an eye on it all the time.
All right. Thoughts on sheet mulching for 100 to 200 square foot areas using cardboard for ivy, mint, that kind of stuff?
It's great. It's absolutely great. And I like this. I think it's a little bit more appropriate for a yard than I do for a public park. But if you put down cardboard, which heaven knows we're inundated with, carpet, pieces of carpet, floor mats, there's so many different things that unfortunately, even black plastic. Now, you can use sheet mulching, and then on top of it, put wood chips, leaves, or whatever, so it doesn't look quite so ugly. And in a number of cases, in a year or 2 years, by the time the cardboard has rotted away, or the carpet has rotted away, the plants underneath will be dead. The one caveat, of course, is that anything you cover the cardboard with ensures that that cardboard is going to be slick. So you probably want to put up some kind of fence around it or some sort of staking around it if it's in a public area, so that somebody doesn't just blithely walk across this leaf area and go sliding on cardboard.
All right. English ivy, is it a skin irritant?
It is for some people. Thank you for bringing this up. Certainly, people's, as wonderfully diverse individuals as humans are, some people are allergic to a lot of plants. Some people are allergic to no plants. And I have heard of people having bad reactions to the sap from English ivy, bad reactions to the sap and the odor from trees of heaven. And so when you put your, as you start recruiting volunteers, it's always best to start people out in rubber gloves, and they're very easy to get if they have sensitive skin. I, for example, when I work with poison ivy, I wear rubber gloves, and then I put plastic newspaper bags on over the rubber gloves because I have such heightened sensitivity to poison ivy. So when you're working in your yard, try it, go slowly, wash your hands well. But for certain volunteers or maybe certain plants that you run into, you may need to take enhanced protection methods.
Awesome. This one is a little bit of a longer question, but still a good one. Japanese knotweed, I have nightmares about it. I'm fighting a large patch based on the neighbor's side of my fence. I've been afraid to plant natives around near the fence where I've removed it because I do not want to attract insects to the area near the glyphosate I have resigned myself to using on the cut stalks. Is this actually a concern, or is it better to try to plant something else with deep roots there? I can't plant trees as it's under power lines.
Well, I think that's very typical for a Japanese knotweed infestation. I am not aware of any Japanese knotweed infestation in Cleveland Heights that sits solely on one native plant lover's yard. It always has come over from somebody else's yard. I do recommend you use glyphosate on the cut stumps. If you can stomach it, you can cover this with cardboard and put mulch, wood chips and leaves over it, and just poke out certain areas and plant in those poked out areas. And you're going to have to leave that black plastic or cardboard in there for 5 years for a Japanese knotweed. And the fact that it's on your neighbor's side of the fence as well, to me says that it would be good to try to have that difficult conversation with your neighbor and say that you're probably going to have to volunteer, would be willing to go after this on their side of the fence as well, because it will never stay just on your neighbor's side of the fence.
All right. Will any native understory woodland plants complete with vinca? I'm going to get it out of my woods, but it's going to keep coming from the neighbors. I'd love to slow it down with a tough native. Same question for Pachysandra coming from the other neighbor. Okay. So that first question about native understory woodland plants competing with vinca.
When you say woodland, I'm assuming it's in the shade. When you say woodland, there are sedges, there's foam flower that you can plant in there. I would suggest foam flower and then put another patch of fairly tightly planted sedges in, and wild ginger is also a good plant to plant in there. And you can pull upstart vinca stems out from all of those plants, among all of those plants without damaging it.
All right. What are your feelings about Dame's rocket? We're going to start moving a little quicker with these questions.
It's in, boy, it's in the mustard. All right, Steve, stop laughing.
I'm stumping you.
It's in the mustard family, if I remember correctly, which means it has prolific seeds. I think it is an annual or a biennial. So I would certainly deadhead this plant. If you can't pull it out, deadhead it wherever you can to try to keep it from going to seed. And over the course of a couple of seasons, you're going to get a diminished population because it's not going to seed. But once it goes to seed, then you have to put a bag over its head before you cut it, because the seeds just explode out when they get ripe.
Gotcha. All right, so back to safety. Do you have any specific advice to avoid ticks as you're in the thick of things pulling out plants?
I do tuck pants into socks and spray my ankles with bug repellent expressly for that purpose, because I think that some of these new diseases that seem to be borne by ticks really creep me out. And so I have a tendency to be a little bit more conservative than most in terms of trying to prevent them from getting in between boots and socks or socks and pants.
Alrighty, just a few more. I have something invasive that blooms similar to Queen Anne's lace that grows along our driveway. It only gets about 18 to 24 inches tall. Any idea of what that is and how to get rid of it?
Might be a parsnip, might be wild carrot. No, not just from what you've described, but then again, if you take your smartphone and both Apple phone, the Apple operating system and the Google operating system have something on the camera, an option on the camera on an Android phone, it's called Google Lens, where you can take a picture of that flower, that plant, and you can then tap, look up, and it'll go out to the web and it will identify it. And I found it to be pretty accurate. So your smartphone can be something that will help you identify things like this by doing an automated lookup when that plant is in bloom or close to in bloom. Use your phone.
Awesome. I like growing mint, but it spreads so quickly. Any tips to keep it contained, or should I just pull it out?
Pull it out and put it in a tall-sided container. And you can grow it in a container, but make sure it doesn't go to seed. Excellent.
And the last question of the evening, why can't deer eat invasives?
I started this talk by saying that 90% of insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants with which they share an evolutionary history. And I think at some point, we're going to understand that the reason deer like native plants so well is simply not to irritate me, although that is a very effective outcome, but it's also because they're plants that they know. And they are branching out, of course. We have invasive hostas, which the deer will eat down to the ground. Those are not native. They are invasive, or they can be invasive. And the deer are eating those. So the deer are gradually learning to eat invasives, but they just don't eat enough of them to keep up with the growth rate of the invasives. And things like barberry and privet and the thorns on common buckthorn make it almost impossible for deer to eat those. So it's a multifaceted answer, but I think that deer, which are rapidly becoming invasive, are not the answer We brought these plants here, and I believe it's our responsibility to help conquer them, which by conquer, I mean push them back far enough to get native plants reestablished.
Awesome. Well, John, from all of us at Friends of Euclid Creek and everybody that's in attendance, we want to give our sincere thanks to you. This was a wonderful presentation. It certainly is inspiring me to go see you guys on a Sunday morning out there and get some work done, and hopefully it's inspiring all of you out there as well. So if you're so inclined and want to get involved, please visit friendsofeuclidcreek.com, become a member, check out our calendar. Our next event is scheduled for February 2nd. It'll be a presentation by Stephen Love of the Cleveland Foundation. He's going to be highlighting all of the environmental initiatives and programs that are going on with the Cleveland Foundation. So I do want to thank you all one last time. John, that was awesome. Thanks a lot. And I hope to see you all at future Friends of Euclid Creek meetings. So if you have any questions, shoot us an email, and we'll see you guys next month for our February 2nd presentation. All right, have a good evening, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, John.